We are live. Welcome back, or if it's your first time joining, thanks for tuning in to episode 2 of First of All, removing all the junk science that you've learned about drugs. Today's episode is going to focus a bit on how drugs work and taking a harm reduction approach to learning about drug science. We believe that if we took a harm reduction based approach to teaching folks about drug science versus a morality-based approach to teaching folks about drug science, we'd be more likely to have harm reduction-based and health-based approaches to drug policy versus, very much moralistic and kind of value-driven approaches to drug policy that we have today. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sasha Simon, MPH. I am the Safety First Senior Program Manager at the Drug Policy Alliance. And I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Ville-Marie Farguada-Narlock, who is the Director of Drug Education at Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Ville-Marie, I'm gonna pull you into this stream real quick.
All right.
Yeah. Ville-Marie, thanks for being my first guest.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for working with the technical issues with me. There she is.
Here I am.
Ville-Marie, I know a little bit about your work, but I'm hoping that you could speak a bit about your role at SSDP, the history of SSDP, and the work that you do there now.
Sure. So I am the Director of Drug Education with SSDP. I have been for a staff member for about 3 years now, but I've been involved with SSDP since for over, it's been over 10 years, since 2009, when I was getting my doctorate, my PsyD, at Roosevelt University in Chicago. That's when I first learned about SSDP. So unfortunately, I was a little bit of a late bloomer when it comes to SSDP, but grateful to have found it. I actually did my dissertation on drug education, and that sort of has made its way into a lot of the work that I do, into the Just Say No peer education program that I develop and run there. So it's a lot of fun.
Cool. So could you talk a bit more about SSDP?
Sure. So Students for Sensible Drug Policy, it's the largest global youth-led network, and it's dedicated to ending the war on drugs. And we sort of do this in 3 different ways, or it's sort of split up in 3 different ways: movement building, education, which is where I come in, and advocacy. And so we're an international network, and really concerned about the impact of the war on drugs on our communities, and know that it's been a failure. And that's why we exist. The organization started back in 1998. With a little grouping of students all over the country who are concerned about drug laws on their campus. And it's sort of grown into this beautiful, amazing global network where we're doing amazing things to end the war on drugs.
That's awesome. I think SSDP provides an amazing model, and the fact that you guys have been doing it for so long and have had such longevity, it shows that there really is a lot of power and a lot of credence to what it is that you guys are pushing forward. And one of the things that I really value about your work is the drug education that you do and the Just Say No program that you guys have. So I'm hoping you can speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, so Just Say No, it's a peer-based drug education and harm reduction program. It's sort of a 2-tiered program where there's a training curriculum for our members to be able to become trained to be peer educators, and that's consists of 13 different sort of mandatory lessons and then a few what we call elective lessons. And the lessons go into things like the history of drug education, drug policy, sort of basics. We talk about stigma, harm reduction, substance use disorders, and then there's a few skills building things mixed in there: program and presentation, listening skills, things like that. Also, so our members have a really well-rounded understanding of the drug war, drug use in general, why people use drugs, and how we're approaching that. And it really gives folks, from what I've heard as far as feedback, really good sort of baseline knowledge, not just to become peer educators, but to do any of the work that we do around drug policy. So then the second sort of component is the drug education piece. So once our members are trained, they're able to provide resources, and they're able to do presentations all about different drugs that are, interesting to them or that they're curious about. We have a whole slew of them already available, and we have more that are being created by our members. That's one of the other really cool parts about the program, is that it really is member driven. So a lot of our lessons, a lot of our content is stuff that our members have contributed, because it's all about sort of what they need and want to know. And so that's the Just Say No program. It's really exciting. I really enjoy doing this work and working with our members in this way. It's great.
And how long have you guys been doing Just Say No, and how many members do you guys have now?
So we officially launched it back in 2016, but it's kind of been a project probably starting back in 2014 when I first started having conversations with some members about it. And so we developed it with our membership, and then had sort of a working group of professionals in the field that also provided some amazing support in sort of getting started and building the curriculum. And then so we've since 2016, we've adapted the program a little bit here and there. We've updated it, so we're on the second edition of the training curriculum now. Because as you know, all of this stuff is always changing. There's always new information coming out. So we try to keep it as up to date as possible and as relevant as possible to our membership. So we've had hundreds of our members going through the training curriculum at any particular given time. We've had 21 members who are fully trained, who have gone through the entire training program. It is an undertaking, right? It's almost like an entire college course. We've actually had members that have been able to get independent study credit for doing it, as part of their studies, which is kind of cool. So it's a lot of work, but the folks who do go through it find it really rewarding, and have been able to sort of use some of those skills and some of that knowledge in their work. We have folks who are frontline harm reduction workers, so, doing direct service and things like that, who have been able to come back to the training curriculum and share resources with their colleagues and clients and things like this. So I find that really important to know that folks are still getting a lot out of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And the fact that it's rewarding for folks after they've completed the program, I think says everything about it. And it's a big goal. I think SSDP and the programming that you guys, it's definitely goals. It sets the standard for safety first, because it's a kind of a baby attempt. We're growing and it's great, but it's still a very initial attempt at trying a harm reduction based approach with teens and high schools. So as we were getting prepped for our talk, we thought it would be really valuable for the viewers to really be able to understand what the difference is between teaching high school students about drugs and teaching college students about drugs. And one of the things that I'll say is that one of the things that I valued about what you just shared is that being on a college campus kind of invites that openness and that independent study, the fact that you can claim college credit, the fact that there is space for you to be able to claim your knowledge and to be able to readily apply your knowledge. So there might be other folks you can join a group with, or, SSDP you can, join and be able to be active with. And you don't have that kind of space in high school necessarily. And I think, and we're still trying to get folks comfortable with the idea of, of teaching kids about harm reduction, and also that they can do something responsible, once they learn about the information. I know some other things that are interesting about high school, and, we'll speak a bit more about later, is around following the scope and sequence of high school learning. So learning drug science and learning about the brain, well, that usually comes a little bit later, maybe around 10th grade in high school. Ideally, you're having students take health in 9th grade, no later than 10th grade, because they haven't started the risk risky behaviors yet, right? You want them to have the information before they start to initiate those behaviors at all. But they likely haven't learned about the brain yet. And so when we try to teach them things about neurons and how they communicate with each other and their synapses and, you know, neuroplasticity, it can be a little bit of a removed concept for a lot of teenagers. And it almost feels unfair to teachers to ask them to, you know, go out of their way to teach science when that may not even be, you know, one of you know, their specialties. So I know that that's a huge thing that we've had to consider whenever we were developing Safety First. I do wonder to what extent you guys kind of go into brain science with Just Say No, and kind of what is the assumed previous knowledge of anyone who's learning from the Just Say No model?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as far as the brain science goes, we do go into it. But we try not to overdo it because it can get real complex and real into the weeds. But the basics being, you know, we've got these neurotransmitters, we've got these receptors in our brain that do different things, and in our bodies that do different things, and certain drugs act on them in certain ways. Right. So we use a variety of different resources to demonstrate that. We really like there's a few different YouTube videos that do sort of like animations or illustrations of how drugs work in the body. And we find that that's a nice way. It's one, they kind of tend to be a little comical, which is always fun to shake things up a little bit. And they provide just enough information without going overboard, so that people kind of get some understanding of how a drug is working in the body. And it's kind of fascinating because, you know, we are designed as humans to have these receptors, have these things in our bodies that accept the drugs, right? And whatever we're putting in there is going to have an effect depending on our individual makeup. So I think humans are kind of fascinating in that way. And that's one of the reasons why I find drugs so fascinating too. So I can get pretty nerdy about it, but and a lot of our members do too, which makes it fun for me. But yeah, still keeping it pretty basic as far as what we're putting out there. But then what we also do is we always provide links to additional information for all of our resources. So anyone that really wants to get into those details can find out where they can do that. And so everyone there's a little bit of something for everyone.
Right on. So I wanted to share a bit about how we approach it with high school students, because we have to start really basic, really small, and really kind of set the tone, and also acknowledge that we're trying to set a whole new tone. So in the very first lesson, if you haven't seen the full Safety First curriculum, is called What is a Drug? And so we define a drug within the curriculum as any substance that in small amounts produces changes in the brain, body, or both. And then students are given the opportunity to really explore what that means. And you get all types of questions, but that will ask their teachers, like, is love a drug? Is water a drug? You know, which is kind of, you know, off the chain in some ways, but you're getting them to understand that anything that you put into your body is going to have some type of impact, it's going to have some type of effect, and you should regulate that, you should manage that, and you should be knowledgeable about what you're putting into your body. Doesn't matter if it's legal, illegal, doesn't matter. So we kind of set that tone so that they understand anything they put into their body is their own responsibility. And then we keep it really super basic with the brain science. These are the graphics that we use to help them understand the brain, also to introduce them to neurons. They get that the brain is the center of intelligence. Okay, that's not too far away. And that they can get the idea that it's made up of neurons. And then we start to move to the idea that these neurons are communicating with neurotransmitters, and they're doing that across gaps called synapses. Depending, of course, on the health teacher's capability to be able to share that information depends on how well the student is actually going to be able to, you know, receive that and retain that. But from there, what we really like to focus on is how drugs are affecting the brain, and particularly the adolescent brain. This is, let me just make sure. Yeah, this is actually exact language from the curriculum from Safety First. Again, we highlight the vocabulary words, try to get them to get it as much as possible, and make it clear that drug use will change the chemical messages and will change what it tells the body to do and how to feel. And it can affect different things like senses, breathing, heart rate, movement, and mood. They can get all of that.
Right.
I think the most important part that we want to get across to them is that they're in this really enviable phase of human development, enviable to me, where their brains are still maturing. And I mean, they're like sponges. They can make so many new connections. And there's a lot that the brain can learn. And there's a lot that the brain can be habituated to. So, you know, there's a lot of parents and teachers who are concerned about their teen using drugs because, of course, they want to save, you know, the sacredness of their brain and their intelligence. And that's a legitimate concern. And so we make it very clear, hey, the brain is the last organ to mature in the body and can take all the way from your mid to late 20s. So try to maybe make your heavier decisions then. So that's kind of where we stop when it comes to, you know, we get into a bit more of some different neurotransmitters, but these are the main points that we try to get across for teenagers in a health class. What we'd like to get to one day is to really flesh out, and we talk about addiction a little bit, but we'd love to be able to have, you know, teens be able to really engage in some of the concepts that you teach and Just Say No.
Yeah, and so we talk a little bit about that too, the neuroplasticity, and we take a little bit further because, you know, if you look at drug use trends, as far as like who's using drugs, it's that 18 to 24 age range where most drugs are being used. And that to us tells us like, okay, this is the you know, our membership, right? These are college students, these are young people. And so it's important to recognize that people that age are using drugs regardless of their neuroplasticity. And so we need to be able to provide them with a little bit more information. And, you know, when we talk about addiction, we talk about it. We have a drug use overview lesson in our training curriculum, and that's mostly where we start to introduce the concept. And really, it's complicated. There's so many different theories about what causes addiction or what addiction even is. And so we provide some information about what the different theories are. And we also talk about just sort of what is the accepted sort of language around addiction. So for us right now, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of, you know, Psychological Disorders. We're on the 5th edition, so that's that DSM-5. And they define it as, you know, substance use disorder. And there's different, you know, symptoms that we look at for determining whether someone has a substance use disorder. And they're pretty broad and vague, which can be useful for some, but not so much for others, depending on the symptoms. So we're looking at things like using a drug in more quantity than you would normally expect, or using more often, or, you know, using despite consequences, you know, having to use more than you were using before, which is called tolerance. So those are sort of some of the symptoms that we look at. We would like to talk a little bit more about the different factors at play and why someone might develop an addiction or a substance use disorder. And so we look at the biopsychosocial model. So that's really sort of putting it all together. So taking all of the different theories into account, and even, you know, and more. So of course, bio is biological, which is our body, our brain. Psycho is psychological, so our thoughts, our feelings, our beliefs, expectations, motivations. And then social, of course, is our social context. So that's where we live, where we use drugs, who we're using with. All of those things are going to impact how a drug is affecting us at any given time, at any given place. And that kind of gets us into this model, this drug set and setting model, which is adapted from Zinberg's drug set and setting. So it was a whole study done on people who use drugs but never actually developed a substance use disorder, never actually became addicted. This is a study back in the 1970s. And this was the first time that we really started to see something that went against what was the common belief of, the highly addictive nature of drugs. And so that started to shift some things for folks. And so we realized that, there's all different sorts of factors that come into play with how a drug impacts us. And so we talk about this drug set and setting in our harm reduction lesson of the Just Say No training. And it really sort of helps us deconstruct the details of drug use. We also talk about dosing as part of the drug, the frequency of use, whether it's a legal drug or not, how you're using it, so the route of administration, all of that comes into play. History of trauma, gender identity, personality, mental and emotional state, any sort of medical conditions, nutrition and sleep are huge ones. And then setting like social support, your community's socioeconomic background, all of this helps us with that more nuanced view of a drug experience. So any sort of issues can be addressed. So this helps us understand where we can apply harm reduction strategies too.
Right on. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
And then we talk a little bit about overdoses, in particular opioid overdoses and also alcohol poisoning within Safety First. But I in particular believe that if a lot more people really understood the science of an overdose, we'd be a lot more keen to learning how to reverse them and also really adopting policies that will make sure they don't happen in the first place. So could you speak a bit about what an overdose is, what the science of an overdose is?
Sure. Yeah, so an overdose, very basically speaking, is a physical response, a biological body response to taking too much of something. So you have too much of a drug that's taking over your receptors, for example, that's making it, difficult for your other functioning, your other natural functioning to happen. So with opioids and other depressants like alcohol, our breathing can stop. And that's where we come into problems, because if we're not breathing, then our heart stops. This is an overdose. With stimulants like methamphetamine and other things, usually it's looking like our heart rate or blood pressure getting really high. Sometimes it leads to a stroke or seizure. So things like this, it's maybe increased temperature, confusion, hallucinations, dehydration. So it looks very different, right? So an opioid or depressant overdose is going to look very different than a stimulant or methamphetamine overdose. So I think it's important to know, because I think we hear a lot about the opioid overdose, which is the not breathing, not being responsive. Maybe your skin color starts to look pale or gray. Your lips or fingertips are looking blue or gray because of that. You're not getting oxygen into your system. So you might not recognize then if someone is overamping, which is what we call a stimulant overdose, because you're not as familiar with those signs. I feel like we've done a good job in general to help people understand what a sign of an opioid overdose is, because of the current overdose concerns that we have right now. And I think it would be helpful to recognize that different drugs have different sort of impacts on the body.
I agree with that. And I appreciate you making that distinction, because it calls into account our work to really teach folks about the breadth of different drugs and different drug classes, because you never know what someone's doing. Just because more of us are dying from a certain drug doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we should know how to be able to identify the symptoms of an overdose for. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think especially with young people who, there's been a concern about young people using stimulants, particularly, college age students. So I think it's useful, at least in our population, the people that we work with, our membership, to understand that difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things I asked Ville-Marie to come on to do is speak a bit more about some harm reduction-based drug policies. And so I wanted to remind folks again what harm reduction is. It's a set of strategies that encourages people to make the safest and healthiest choice they can based on their circumstances, Once again, I want to really emphasize it's based on their circumstances. It's not based on your circumstances. It's not based on your sense of morality. It's not based on any of that. It's a person making their own choices based on what's best for them. So one of the best ways somebody could do that is to develop drug knowledge, learn how drugs work. It's important for everyone, regardless if you do drugs or not. It's important for everyone to know the basic effects, risks, benefits, and harms of drugs in order to make safer and healthier choices. So it's not just about you, there's people around you. I think that's something we're being reminded of when it comes to COVID. So it's a benefit to all of us to not just know harm reduction strategies, but to also develop some drug knowledge so we can take care of the people around us. Check the substance. Vilmarie is going to get a bit into drug checking, which when I learned about it from Stephanie Jones at DPA, I was geeked because I didn't realize that was something you can do. But you can actually check your drugs. It's also known as drug testing or adulterant screening, and allows users to get more information about what's in their substance. I'm not the expert, Vilmarie is. I'm going to let her go into that. And then lastly, things do happen, unfortunately, so it's important to know how to respond to an emergency, and in particular, know how to respond to an emergency before that emergency has the chance to even happen. So don't be afraid to call 911, have an idea what the Good Samaritan laws are in your state, in your county. And of course, Good Samaritan laws are there for people to protect people who call 911 for help for drug-related incidences. So one of the things that's used quite commonly whenever, especially an opioid related overdose or incidents happens, is Naloxone. And so I'm hoping you could speak a bit more about what Naloxone is.
Of course, yeah. Naloxone, also known as Narcan as a brand name, is probably one of our best and first lines of defense when it comes to the overdose epidemic, if you will. And it's an opioid overdose reversal drug. So it reverses the effects of opioids like heroin for about an hour at a time. It's kind of amazing because it doesn't really have any other effect on the body on its own, which means that there's no potential for misuse. It only works if you have opioids in your system. So someone who is experiencing an overdose can be administered naloxone, and essentially the naloxone kicks the opioids out of the receptors so that the opioid effect is no longer happening on the person, and that essentially reverses them having that overdose. So it's kind of really amazing. Most places you can get it at your pharmacy. You don't need a prescription in most places to have it. Anyone who uses, painkillers or other opioids for a medical reason or any other reason should have naloxone on hand and should know how to use it, should have their family members know how to use it in case they forget and maybe take more than they're supposed to, or in case they're using and there's maybe some sort of combination in their drug that they weren't intending. So for example, fentanyl is a pretty common thing in the opioid supply nowadays. And it's very, very high potency opioid. And for that, what we're finding is that, one dose of naloxone usually isn't enough because the opioid is so strong. So you usually need more than one dose, sometimes 3 or 4 doses, depending, to really reverse that overdose. So that's why it's important, like Sasha mentioned before, to call 911 also in the event of an overdose. Because, particularly when we're talking about illicit opioids that aren't, got purchased from a pharmacy or aren't part of a prescription, it's less likely that you know what's in there. So there might be other things, might be fentanyl mixed in, that is going to make that overdose a little bit more challenging to reverse.
And so what are safe consumption sites? We call them overdose prevention centers for our safety first audience because it's a little bit, more family friendly, but that's even kind of a misnomer. And I'll let you speak a bit more to that.
Yeah, so safe consumption sites are probably our second best, if not the actual best way to address the overdose problem. So we also talk about this in our Just Say No program in our harm reduction lesson, because it is such an amazing harm reduction strategy. They're also known as drug consumption rooms, safe injection sites, overdose prevention centers, like you said. But essentially, they're safe, sterile facilities where someone can use their previously obtained drugs. They're supervised by nurses or other health professionals. And they can also offer sterile works or use materials like syringes. They offer overdose prevention, so everyone there is equipped with Naloxone. They can offer other forms of support, counseling. Some offer things like HIV and Hep C testing and treatment. Others have hygiene services and other healthcare services, including connection and referral to treatment for those who are interested in that. So they can be as basic as just the safe consumption space and having that naloxone on hand, the healthcare worker on hand, and sterile works, all the way to almost a full, like, multifaceted healthcare facility that can also provide all of these other sources. Now, unfortunately, there are some legal and policy issues that make it a huge barrier to be able to operate one of these in the United States. There has been some legal precedent set in Philadelphia, essentially saying that this, as a healthcare service, does not go against some previously codified laws that essentially make it illegal to operate any sort of place where there's drugs involved. So these are called crack house laws. And essentially, if people are using drugs in a facility, they would be considered a crack house or a facility where drugs are present or drugs are being used, and that's illegal. However, because drug consumption sites provide a very necessary healthcare service, we're seeing more and more cities, states looking at this as a viable option to address the overdose issue that we're dealing with right now.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so I know another thing another great policy that's impacted by crack house laws are drug checking. Makes it very difficult to be able to institute. So could you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah. So drug checking also falls into those policy barriers, but there's also separate paraphernalia policies that many states have, where in the language, it basically says anything that's used to analyze, assess, check for potency or check for adulterants is also considered paraphernalia and therefore illegal to possess and use. So that has made drug checking a little bit of an issue, though some states, fortunately Illinois being one of them, have been able to enact some laws to address that. So drug checking is essentially a way to check whether the drug that you have is what you intend to take. It helps to identify whether it's been adulterated or cut with something more harmful. And there's sort of three main options. There's reagent kits, and I've got some, I think if you keep scrolling through, I've got photos in here, Sasha.
Okay.
Yeah.
And these are the reagent kits, right?
So these are reagents, and if you can go to dancesafe.org, where you can purchase them. You can also find out how to use them. They have videos, but essentially with using a very small sample of your substance, and with a slew of these different reagents, you can kind of get a sense of whether your drug is adulterated. It can't tell you that it is necessarily that drug, but it can tell you sort of what else might be in there, which can be really useful, particularly because these are pretty portable. And DanceSafe, for example, is able to take them to concerts and festivals and provide on-site drug checking with reagents. It's a really great service that they provide. And then we get into some of the fancier stuff. So like spectrometry, for example. So this is an FTIR machine. And they're very expensive. But you can get back results on what's in there. It detects a wide range of compounds in under 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, depending on the skill level of the technician. So these are even more accurate than the reagents.
Well, Marie, I have a question. How would I be able to use something like that, if at all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's pretty limited access, but there are some organizations around the states that have, the states and Canada, that are working under various grants from the CDC and other organizations to help capture some information about drug trends and drug supply, and also provide harm reduction drug checking for their community. So, for example, the Chicago Recovery Alliance here in Chicago is part of this group of organizations that we call ACDC, which is the Alliance for Collaborative Drug Checking. And so they've gotten grant funding to purchase one of these machines. So if you have an organization like CRA, Chicago Recovery Alliance, in your area, I think there's also some in California, some in Boston. Generally, they're doing sort of drop-off testing where you can bring your drug to them, and they'll help provide you with some results. And then there's also this high-pressure mass spectrometry, which is a sort of more portable version.
Is that the next one? The next image?
The next one, yeah.
Oh, I see.
You can see it's a little more portable. This is, I know a lot of law enforcement uses this in the field because, as you can see, they can kind of bring it around with them. This one also takes 5 to 10 minutes. It detects sort of active substances and in their drug ID library for this particular system. It doesn't require as much training as something like the FTIR machine, so it's a little bit more accessible that way. Still very expensive, but like I said, some of these organizations have gotten their hands on these through grant funding to be able to sort of cross-reference results from the different machines that they have, which is also kind of interesting because they're seeing how accurate and what different sort of things are showing up as, what different substances are showing up as on the different machines. So they're getting a lot of really interesting data and also providing really important information to their participants about what's maybe in their drug supply. And the cool thing that we're seeing with drug checking is that there is some behavior change that happens. So if someone finds out that there's something in their drug that they don't really want to be taking, a lot of people are choosing not to take it, or they're choosing to take less, or otherwise altering their behavior in sort of that harm reduction way. And then I think the last example that I have here are the fentanyl test strips. So yeah, so as I mentioned before, fentanyl is a really, really, really high potency opioid that has been showing up in the supply of opioids and some other things, some cocaine, but mostly other opioids. And it's basically, it's designed to be sort of like a urine test strip. But what we've found is that actually, if you dilute your drug, just a tiny little bit of your drug in some water, the test strip also works to identify whether there's any fentanyl in there. So it's just testing for the presence or absence of fentanyl and other fentanyl analogs, so other types of this kind of synthetic opioid. Doesn't provide any information as far as the quantity or anything like that, but it can tell you whether there's fentanyl in your drug. Doesn't really require a whole lot of training. You just have to know how to read the little strip. So that's another thing that a lot of harm reduction organizations are providing their participants. So along with naloxone, you'll probably get, your fentanyl test strip as well.
And how long does it take to get results from these test strips?
Anywhere from like 5 minutes usually.
Oh God, I love science. That is incredible.
It's pretty quick, right?
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. I remember we were talking before, it seems pretty similar to the harm reduction strategy for HIV prevention. I remember way back in the day, I used to do a lot of mobile health testing and do the swab in the mouth and you can give someone a result, not even this quickly, but in about 20 minutes, you'd have an idea, or you would know if they tested positive or not. So I think it's incredible that you can do something so hands-on right there, right where you're at with drug use too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty, and it's super useful, right? Like I said, if people can have that information so quickly, they can make more informed choices.
Absolutely. All right, so there's a few episode takeaways. The very first one is that there's no inherent moral value in drugs. Hopefully, Ville-Marie and I were able to share a bit and convince folks of that. But even if you and I hold that belief and our colleagues hold that belief, still morality plays a major role in the delivery of drug education, but we're fighting to change that. Also, misperceptions about drugs and drug users. I think a very big one that you just cleared up is that drug users are not dumb, right? If given the tools to be able to take care of themselves, they will. And morality also plays a major role in the policy decisions that legislators make, because they also got morality-based education. So that's kind of their paradigm around drug policy and drugs in general.
Right.
Also, drug policies themselves can harm people's health. Like you spoke about earlier, Ville-Marie, the crack house laws that don't allow more harm reduction-based policies to even really be utilized, even though we know that they're effective, because we have laws that kind of cramp down on that.
Right.
But at the same time, and I took this from SSDP. Actually, this either came from SSDP's website or this came from Safety First approach to drug education. Either way, I'm pretty proud of the work that we do. Because harm reduction is an attitude about how to approach public health problems with knowledge, love, and empowerment, rather than enforcing healthy choices with punishment.
Love it.
And I think that's an incredibly important message right now, regardless if it's drugs, sex, whatever. We're at an incredibly important moment where all of our public health matters. And we have to find a way to teach each other that's not shaming each other, that's not going out of our way to punish or, financially punish anyone, but we really have to take care of each other, take care of ourselves, and know how to do that.
That's right.
Ville-Marie, I'm super stoked that you came on. I loved everything. I tried to stay calm, but I geeked out. And I'm sure many people
I do it too.
I'm sure many people got to geek out at home. Folks want more information about Ville-Marie's work, go to ssdp.org/justsayno. Ville-Marie, any final words that you want to leave folks with?
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to mention is that we have our virtual conference coming up at the beginning of May. So if people are interested in learning more about the work that SSDP does and seeing some of our folks in action, we moved our conference to a virtual platform. So if you go to conference.ssdp.org, you can find out all about that and get registered. It's going to be really exciting. I'm doing a few different panels, including one about drug education. So it should be a good time.
Awesome. And what are the dates for that?
So May 1st through the 3rd, that weekend.
Perfect. So we'll try to get a link into the description for this video so folks can check that out. But thanks again, everyone who tuned in. Hope you're staying safe. Hope you're staying sane. Ville-Marie, thanks again. I had a blast.
Thanks so much, Sasha. This was great.
Awesome. Everybody take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.